Kermis, Dawking. Kermis always was old as long as I can remember. Fact is, I don't really remember the first time I saw him. In my earliest recollections, I'd be playing along the broken down fence road toward the back of our rented property. Oh, we had a bunch of acres, I don't really know how many. Sure seemed a lot when I was young. We'd grow all kinds of different stuff, some to eat, some to try and sell in town to other folks so we could buy other things we needed. Sometimes we'd grow corn out by the back of the lot, and when it would start getting tall, it was kind of fun to play out there behind it, along that old fence that wasn't much of a fence. It was really quiet back there, and with a good imagination, a few stones, some trees, and a few other odds and ends thrown in from around our place, a kid could fight wars, tackle giants, scout new worlds, or a little further out, past the back of our property, spend a whole afternoon lazily laying on the bank of the little creek, catching a few fish or crawdads. Well, just on the other side of the fence line was an old path, been there for years. As far back as I can remember, I'd see an old man with a full beard come walking down that path going somewhere. I didn't really know for a long time where he was going because he never seemed to come back. He was always just going when I saw him. I'd always try to hide and act like I was spying on him. Sometimes he was a monster, sometimes the enemy in war, or just a weary traveler. Sometimes he was a general in a worn-down ragtag army, fighting for what seemed like a useless but worthy cause. He never seemed to be in a hurry, but neither did he seem to be the talking kind of guy. I guess I wasn't exactly refined in the ways of conversation myself. I remember the first time I spoke to him, I said, "Hey, what's your name?" He'd caught me spying on him and smiled a big toothy smile, which actually he'd done many times before, but I was just too chicken to talk to him. He slowed down his walk, then stopped. He slowly turned directly toward me and putting his hands on his hips. I was kind of wondering if maybe I shouldn't have said anything. And he said, "Well, my name, mister, is Kermis. Kermis Dawking, what's yours?" Of course, I told him my name was David. I said, "Well, people used to call me Davy, but now that I'm getting older, I don't let them do that no more." He said he agreed and asked me how old I was, and I told him proudly, I'm 5 now. He said that made us close in age. He said that he was 75, so the only difference was a 7. We was best buddies from then on. I should have known better than to call an older gentleman by his first name, but it never dawned on me that he was an older gentleman until years later. We was always just best friends. Besides, that's what he told me to call him. Kermis would stop by and catch me playing. We'd sit on an old log that must have been there since our house was born and talk for what seemed like hours. He'd tell me stories about his experiences in the war and sailing out on the deep sea and other countries and different people. Yeah, he was spellbinding. Then he'd listen to my tales of adventure. He always acted like my stories were just as important as his. He taught me some tricks about fishing, how to whittle with a knife, how to tie a knot that wouldn't come apart, and how to whistle a tune. I remember the first time he took me on a long walk with him. I finally figured out why he was always just going and never coming back. We walked and walked and walked and walked. Of course, we was talking and he was showing me things. It was not boring, but it did seem like we walked forever. Then we stopped and he said, "This is where I live." I looked around and around, and I turned all the way around, and then I figured it out. He was pulling my leg. When he realized that I thought he was joking, he laughed out loud, then smiled real big and said, "No, really, look up." When I looked up, I saw a rope hanging, and further up I saw the biggest tree house I had ever even dreamed of. My mouth fell open, and probably for the first time in my life, I was speechless. He pulled that rope, and a big sturdy ladder came sliding down to us. He invited me up, so a moment later we were in his living room. I couldn't believe it. He had everything up there and told me all about it. He had rigged a system to collect rainwater and hold it till he turned the faucet. He had a wood-burning stove up there, some nicely done homemade furniture, windows with curtains, an old scrubbing board for laundry, and to my amazement, an old record player that you turned a crank to get it going. Then you put the needle on, and now you had music. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Then he said, "Would you like to go to the basement?" I couldn't even imagine what he was talking about. We went back down the ladder. He gave the rope a yank, and the ladder disappeared. We walked around behind a tree and over behind some scrub brush, up over to the other side of a little hill. On the other side of that little hill was a door in the side of the hill. He opened the door and again invited me to step inside. I literally tried to pinch myself. Did it so hard I made a bruise to see if I was at home in my bed dreaming. Inside he had furnishings just like another room in a house. Another stove, another water system. This time he told me about, and later pointed out to me, a really tall windmill that he'd put together that actually generated electricity so he could have lights, and an old simple heater that he'd made. At the back of this big room was another door that led to a room where he could keep food pretty cold. Needless to say, I was really amazed. When we left, I walked in almost a daze. We walked for a little while and I saw our fence row. I knew where we were now, and I figured out that he never did come back. He always walked all the way around his property. One time we was on one of our walks down by the creek, and Kermis was just a-whistling this tune over and over till pretty soon I picked it up and we whistled together. I don't know, but Kermis said it sounded pretty good. Lots of times we wouldn't be talking, just doing stuff together. This was one of those times. We did a little fishing, some whittling, some whistling. I was doing something and realized that Kermis wasn't moving about much, so I looked up and saw he was looking at some kind of book and asked him what it was. He said, "Oh, just an old good book," and asked me if I'd like to hear a story. Of course, I always loved stories, so he read me one. I don't remember what it was, but it was really good, and I told him so. So then after that, a lot of times, he'd read me a story out of that book, and they was always good. Sometimes we'd talk about them. They always seemed to have a real good meaning. He seemed to always have that little black book with him, and we had a lot of good times with it. But then I always had a good time with Kermis, no matter what we was doing. I guess we was poor folks. My mama was a real good lady and worked real hard. Never complained much that I can remember. Looking back now, I think it would have been all right if she would have a little. My daddy, who I don't really remember, had died in a farm accident when I was quite little, and Mama was left with me, my older brother Charles, we called him Junior, and my little sister Maggie, we just called her Sissy. She didn't have nobody to help her, so we did whatever we could to make things work. As I mentioned, we raised crops for ourselves and sold them. Mama took in washing, ironing, and mending, and cleaned rich folks' houses. There seemed to always be plenty of work to do, especially certain times of the year. I had been working a lot with Junior on bringing in the crops and hadn't seen Kermis in several days, so when I got a little break, I went for a walk around his property. I was just meandering slowly, and when I finally got over near his underground house, I saw him sitting against a tree with his book in his lap, just reading away. He was so much into what he was reading that he didn't even realize that I was near. I hollered to him when I was a ways off, but he didn't hear me. I wondered if he'd fallen asleep. So when I got up to him, I shouted, poked his arm. He just kept on reading. I looked down at his book and noticed that it looked like the pages had been rained on and now were dry. So I stooped down to look closer at him to see if he really was asleep. When I looked at his eyes, I remember thinking, he's not in there. And tears started to come to mine. Being on a farm, I'd seen death a few times. I wanted to keep his little black book, but decided he should have it. They buried him with it, held in his hands, laying on his chest. I still kind of wished I'd kept it.